You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
On a winter night in 1604, a new star burned through the velvet of the sky. In Prague, a thin, nearsighted mathematician stood at a window and took notes by candlelight. That man, Johannes Kepler, believed the heavens were legible, that number and harmony were the alphabet of creation. I made this episode because Kepler sits exactly where our show loves to work, at the seam where mysticism meets measurement, where sacred geometry becomes celestial mechanics, and where an astrologer, schoolteacher, refugee, and court mathematician chisel law out of wonder. Kepler's life is a parable for anyone trying to keep faith and reason in the same room. He cast horoscopes to pay rent, then scrapped circles for eclipses because the data said so. He wrote prayers into his proofs. He defended his mother in a witchcraft trial and still found the patience to compute Mars for years. His voice, equal parts devout and defiant, tells us that truth is the daughter of time, and it is time we let him speak. Tonight we follow him step by step. From Wilderstadt to the lecture halls of Tübingen, from the Platonic dreams of Mysterium Cosmographicum to the hard, stubborn numbers of Astronomia Nova, from the music of the spheres and Harmonices Mundi to the glass and light of Dioptrus, from Graz to Prague, to Linz to Ulm, carrying tables, depths, and a vision of order that outlived the 30 Years' War. We're here to read Kepler in his own words, to place him in the world he walked, mud streets, church bells, printing presses, plague carts, and to ask what his laws, his optics, his reformed astrology, and his lunar dream mean for art, ritual, and the modern imagination. If you ever looked up and felt that hush, to sense the sky isn't just scenery but syntax, this is your episode. Johannes Kepler lived from 1571 to 1630, and he lived in an age of religious turmoil and scientific rebirth. He was a German astronomer, mathematician, astrologer, and natural philosopher, a visionary who helped transform Renaissance mysticism into empirical science of the scientific revolution. Kepler is best known for discovering the laws of planetary motion, foundational principles that guided later scientists like Isaac Newton toward the theory of gravity. But Kepler was more than a mathematician. He was a man of deep faith and imagination, convinced that the cosmos was an orderly creation imbued with meaning. Those laws of nature are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. Kepler wrote expressing the belief that deciphering the heavens was a way to think God's thoughts after him. His life's work was driven by this almost spiritual quest for cosmic harmony and truth. In telling Kepler's story, one finds a narrative as dramatic as the times in which he lived. He witnessed the fading of old certainties, the geocentric Earth, Earth-centered universe, and the sharp divide between science and superstition, and he helped usher in new understanding grounding in observation, geometry, and physics. Yet Kepler's path was not easy. He endured war, religious persecution, personal tragedies, and even a witchcraft trial against his own mother. Through it all, he remained scrupulously honest to the data and to his convictions. The result was a legacy that spans astronomy and optics, music and mysticism, religion and philosophy. This episode follows Kepler's journey chronologically, from his humble beginnings in education, through his wanderings across Europe in search of intellectual refuge, to his scientific triumphs, while also exploring the rich tapestry of influences, ideas, and historical events that shaped his work. As we shall see, Kepler much preferred the sharpest criticism of a single intelligent man to the thoughtless approval of the masses, forging a unique path that married rigorous science with a profound sense of wonder. Johannes Kepler was born on December 27, 1571, in the small Swabian town of Wilderstadt in the Holy Roman Empire in modern Germany. He came from a modest and tumultuous family background. His father, Heinrich Kepler, was a mercenary soldier who left home when Johannes was young and likely died abroad by 1577, and his mother, Katharina Guldenmann, was the daughter of an innkeeper known for her herbal remedies and folk healing. The Kepler family had been respected in earlier generations. Johannes' grandfather, Sebald Kepler, had even served as mayor of their city, but by the time of Johannes' birth, their fortunes had dwindled. Born prematurely and frequently ill in childhood, Kepler was a frail boy with weak vision. A bout of smallpox left his eyes damaged and his hands crippled. Yet, he showed early intellectual gifts and an almost mystical awe for the heavens. In 1577, at just 6 years old, Johannes' mother took him to a high place to witness the Great Comet of 1577, a spectacle that captivated astronomers across Europe. He later recalled being entranced by the bright comet hanging in the sky. 2 years later, in 1580, he was called outside at night to see a lunar eclipse, noting how the moon appeared quite red, another formative experience for the young stargazer. These childhood events kindled a passion for astronomy that would last his entire life, even though his poor eyesight meant he would never be known for making telescopic discoveries like Galileo. Kepler himself joked that although his mind was skybound, the shadow of his body lies here on Earth, a poignant reflection he would later choose for his epitaph. Encouraged by his family's Lutheran faith and by his own evident intellect, Kepler pursued an education that combined classical learning with religious training. He attended local Latin schools, and in 1584, at age 13, he entered the Protestant seminary at Edinburgh. He proved to be a brilliant student. By 1589, Kepler earned a scholarship to the University of Tübingen, a leading Protestant university, to study theology and prepare for the Lutheran ministry. At Tübingen's Tübingerstift Seminary, Kepler received a thorough grounding in classical philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. His mentor in mathematics and astronomy was Michael Maslin, one of the few academics of the time who embraced the Copernican heliocentric model, though cautiously and only in private lectures. Under Maslin's guidance, Kepler learned both the traditional Ptolemaic Earth-centered system and the revolutionary Copernican Sun-centered system of planetary motion. Kepler was quickly won over to Copernican's vision. He later wrote that it was at Tübingen that he became a Copernican for what he called physical or, if you prefer, metaphysical reasons. In other words, he sensed that a sun-centered cosmos had a deeper natural truth and harmony to it. Indeed, Kepler's faith in a rational, God-created order predisposed him to favor a system where the sun, symbol of God's light, sat at the center. As a student, he even engaged in a public disputation defending heliocentrism on both scientific and theological grounds, arguing that the sun is the principal source of motion to the universe. This was bold, given that Lutheran and Catholic authorities alike still regarded heliocentrism with suspicion. Kepler's subtle deviations from strict Lutheran doctrine already began causing friction. He refused to fully subscribe to the Formula of Concord in 1577, a Lutheran confession of faith, because he had private doubts on points of theology. Because of these scruples, Kepler's hopes of becoming a pastor dimmed. Nevertheless, he saw no conflict between faith and science. I wanted to become a theologian. For a long time I was unhappy. Now behold, God is praised by my work, even in astronomy, Kepler later reflected. To him, uncovering the mathematical laws of creation was a form of devotion. This conviction set the stage for his life's work. In 1594, at the age of 22, Johannes Kepler left academia to begin a career in teaching, and, incidentally, in government service as an astrologer. He was recommended for and accepted a post as professor of mathematics at the Protestant seminary in Graz, in the Austrian province of Styria. In this role, he taught arithmetic, geometry, and sometimes Greek and rhetoric to the school students. He also carried the title of district mathematician, which meant he was responsible for issuing official calendars and astrological almanacs, a lucrative and respected task at the time. In the late 16th century, there was no firm separation between astronomy and astrology. The two were considered two sides of the same coin. Like other learned astronomers, even Tycho Brahe and Galileo, Kepler practiced astrology to earn his keep. He cast horoscopes for wealthy patrons and local nobility and made weather and political predictions in annual calendars. Though he privately disdained the more superstitious aspects of astrology, he conceded that mother astronomy would surely have to suffer hunger if the daughter astrology did not earn their bread. In other words, it was astrology that paid the bills, allowing him to pursue pure astronomy. Kepler spent a huge amount of time trying to reform astrology on a sounder footing, composing over 800 horoscopes and several treatises on the subject. He aimed to distill whatever he thought scientifically plausible. For instance, effects of the sun, moon, and planets mediated through an earth soul, via harmonies or light, from what he called the swinish rashness of fortune tellers. In 1601, he even wrote a short work on giving astrology sounder foundations to accompany one of his almanacs. And in 1610, when two other authors feuded over astrology merits, Kepler intervened with a tract, Third Party Intervening, cautioning that while much astrological superstition deserves rejection, one must not throw the baby out with the bathwater by dismissing real cosmic influences. This balanced approach typified Kepler's unique blend of mysticism and empiricism during his Grazias. Even while he fulfilled his public duties, Kepler was pursuing an audacious private research program, an attempt to decipher the geometrical plan of the cosmos. Shortly after arriving in Graz, he experienced what he described as a moment of illumination. On July 19, 1595, while teaching a class, Kepler was explaining the periodic conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter in the zodiac when he had an epiphany. He realized that the intervals between planets might be explained by pure geometry. Initially, Kepler tried inscribing and circumscribing one circle between another using regular polygons, seeking a unique geometric spacing for the 6 known planets, but this approach failed to much observations. He then contemplated 3-dimensional shapes. In a breakthrough, Kepler imagined nesting the 5 periodic Platonic solids, one inside another, each separated by circumscribed and inscribed sphere. There were only 5 such polyhedra, and placing them in the proper order produced 6 layers, which he identified with the 6 planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. To Kepler's delight, the model roughly matched the relative sizes of the planets' orbits as known from Copernicus's data, especially for planets beyond Mercury. He believed he had glimpsed the very geometric blueprint of God. Geometry is co-eternal with God, and God used it in laying out the world. Kepler would write later, reflecting his Neoplatonic conviction that geometrical forms give structure to creation. With almost evangelical zeal, the young astronomer set out to share his revelation. In 1596, at just 25 years old, Kepler published his first book, Mysterium Cosmographicum, The Mystery of the Cosmos. This was his first bold attempt to decipher the divine geometric plan of the universe. Kepler was a deeply religious thinker who believed that God, the great mathematician, had built the cosmos with mathematical harmony. Inspired by quasi-mystical revelation while teaching in Graz, he became convinced that the spacing of the 6 known planets was no accident. It must be patterned after the 5 perfect Platonic solids of antiquity. Kepler set out to prove that each planetary orbit is separated by a nested polyhedron, inscribed and circumscribed by spheres, matching the orbit of one planet to the next. This elegant model, he thought, explained why there were exactly 6 planets and provided a compelling geometric rationale for Copernicus's sun-centered system. Kepler's Mysterium was the first published defense of Copernican heliocentrism since Copernicus himself, and it was strikingly unusual for the blending rigorous astronomy with Neoplatonic mysticism. In the book's preface, he declared his mission to show that God, in creating the universe and regulating the order of the cosmos, had in view the 5 regular bodies of geometry, and that he has fixed, according to those geometric dimensions, the number of the heavens, their proportions, and relations of their movements. The Mysterium did more than propose a poetic model. It insisted that astronomy must explain the actual spacing of planetary orbits in 3-dimensional space, not just their abstract order. To Kepler, Copernicus's system implied a physical reality in which nothing could be altered without upsetting the harmony of the whole. This mindset led him to consider the sun's force as a cause of planetary motion, weakening with distance, a prescient insight that nudged astronomy away from purely kinematic models towards physics. Although the Platonic solid model itself was not quantitatively accurate, its beauty and haunting strangeness captivated Kepler and set him on a path of asking deeper questions. He even published a second edition 25 years later, unwilling to abandon the idea that some fundamental harmonies underlies the cosmos. With hindsight, we see Mysterium Cosmographicum as an important stepping stone, an empirically inaccurate but aesthetically beautiful hypothesis that nevertheless prompted Kepler to seek physical causes and would ultimately lead to his monumental laws of planetary motion. While in Graz, Kepler also began side studies in chronology and astrology, even trying to link planetary positions to weather and earthly events. He speculated about the Earth having a soul that responds to the positions of the planets. This was part of a grand plan that he had sketched out to write several books on the stationary sun and fixed stars, on planetary motions, on the physical nature of planets, and on the influences of the heavens on Earth. The Mysterium was only the first installment of this ambitious program. However, events in Graz would soon disrupt Kepler's work and force him to flee. The Counter-Reformation was gathering steam under Archduke, soon Emperor, Ferdinand II, a staunch Catholic determined to root out Protestantism in his realms. Tensions in Styria mounted. In September 1598, a decree expelled all Protestant teachers and preachers from Graz. Initially, Kepler was exempted from expulsion because of his valuable status as district mathematician. The authorities did not want to lose the calendar maker. But Kepler felt far from safe. That year, he wrote to a friend that he foresaw dark times ahead. Sure enough, by 1599, his position was untenable. Meanwhile, in Prague, Tycho Brahe had been appointed imperial mathematician to Emperor Rudolf II. Tycho, the great Danish astronomer, was eager for a skilled assistant to help make sense of his vast treasury of planetary observations. He had heard of Kepler's talent for theoretical insight. In December 1599, Tycho extended an invitation to Kepler to join him in Prague. Kepler leapt at the opportunity. Without even waiting for the formal letter to arrive, he set off from Graz on January 1st, 1600, heading north to Bohemia in hopes that Tycho's patronage could solve both his scientific quandaries and his precarious political situation. Kepler's departure from Graz was abrupt. He left behind his post and the home that he had established there, and it must be noted, he left in the company of some emotional turmoil. During his Graz years, Kepler had fallen in love and married. In December 1595, he met Barbara Muller, a 23-year-old, twice-widowed young woman with a small daughter. Barbara came from a prosperous family. Her father was a successful mill owner, whereas Kepler was an impecunious scholar. Her father was initially opposed to the match, considering Kepler's poverty unacceptable despite his noble ancestry. Only after Kepler finished Mysterium Cosmographicum, perhaps proving his potential, did her family relent, and Barbara and Johannes married on April 27, 1597. The marriage, in its early years, was reportedly strained by financial worries and by Kepler's single-minded focus on his studies. They had 2 children in Graz, in 1598 and 1599, but tragically both infants, a son Heinrich and a daughter Susanna, died in infancy. It was amid these personal trials that Kepler abandoned Graz. By September 1600, after a final edict demanded that all Protestants convert to Catholicism or leave Styria, Kepler and Barbara, pregnant again, packed their belongings and fled Graz for Prague, effectively as religious refugees. Kepler did not know it yet, but he would never return to the life of a provincial schoolteacher. Ahead lay his most productive scientific years under the patronage of the Holy Roman Emperor. When Kepler arrived in Prague in early 1600, he entered an environment that must have seemed like the promised land to a man obsessed with astronomy. Tycho Brahe welcomed him to the Imperial Observatory and soon put Kepler to work analyzing observations of Mars. Mars was famously the most troublesome planet for astronomers. Its apparent backward retrograde motions and changes in brightness had defied simple explanation in circular orbit models. Tycho possessed the most precise Mars data ever obtained. Measured without telescopes, using giant sighting instruments, his measurements were accurate within an arc-minute or 2. For the first time, Kepler had the accurate empirical foundation he needed. However, Tycho was protective of his data. He did not initially allow Kepler unlimited access or copies of his observations. Kepler estimated it might take him up to 2 years of hard work to test his geometric theories against Tycho's Mars data, since he would have to perform calculations on site. He and Tycho had a brief falling out in the spring of 1600 over formal employment terms and salary that led Kepler to leave for a short time. Fortunately, they reconciled quickly and reached an agreement. Tycho recognized Kepler's value and secured him a position as an imperial collaborator by summer of 1600. After returning to Graz briefly to collect his family, Kepler settled in Prague for good. Tragically, Kepler's direct collaboration with the illustrious Tycho would be short-lived. In October 1601, only about a year after Kepler arrived, Tycho Brahe died suddenly. Tycho's death threatened to leave Kepler stranded, but the Emperor Rudolf II promptly appointed Kepler as Tycho's successor, imperial mathematician. This was the most prestigious post for a mathematician in Europe, essentially making Kepler the court astronomer. It also gave him custody of Tycho's precious astronomical data. After some wrangling with Tycho's heirs, who tried to claim the data was private property, Kepler gained access to the observations he needed. He was keenly aware of the importance of this moment. He had in his hands the raw material to revolutionize astronomy. To us, on whom divine benevolence has bestowed the most diligent of observers, Tycho Brahe, from whose observations this 8-minute error in the orbit of Mars is deduced, it is fitting that we accept with grateful minds this gift from God and both acknowledge and build upon it, referring to a tiny discrepancy Tycho had found in Mars's orbit that hinted the ancient models were wrong. Kepler would indeed build upon Tycho's legacy, and in doing so, he changed our view of the cosmos. As imperial mathematician in Prague, Kepler's duties were twofold. For example, providing astrological forecasts and calendars to the emperor, and to conduct astronomical research, including the completion of the new Rudolphine tables, an updated set of astronomical tables, planetary positions, star catalogs, etc., using Tycho's superior observations. Emperor Rudolf II was an enlightened and eccentric patron of the sciences, interested in astronomy, alchemy, and all matter of esoteric knowledge. He tolerated Kepler's Lutheran faith, despite Prague being officially Catholic. In practice, Kepler had a fair degree of intellectual freedom at Rudolf's court, even as he struggled with intermittent salary payments from the cash-strapped imperial treasury. It was an invigorating situation. Kepler rubbed shoulders with other learned men in Prague, from jewelers turned mathematicians like Jost Berge to scholars like Johannes Matthäus Wacker and David Fabricius. This collegial atmosphere, combined with Kepler's own single-minded determination, led to an explosion of productivity. The 11 years Kepler spent in Prague, 1601 to 1612, would be the most scientifically fruitful time of his life. One of Kepler's first targets of study was the orbit of Mars, continuing the work Tycho had assigned him. Kepler approached the problem with a novel mindset. He was willing to abandon the ancient assumption that planetary motions must be combinations of uniform circular paths. Instead, he sought a single unified orbit for Mars shaped by a physical cause, what he called a celestial physics. He suspected the sun was the source of a force that drove the planets, an idea inspired by his belief that the sun symbolized God the Father, and likely influenced by William Gilbert's 1600 book, De Magnete, which posited a magnetic soul in the Earth. Kepler theorized that a force emanating from the sun weakened with distance, causing planets further out to move more slowly, a remarkable prescient intuition. We can recognize in it an early notion of a gravitational or magnetic inverse square law. Armed with Tycho's precise measurements of Mars positions at various points in its orbits, Kepler attacked the data with tireless calculations. He tried one geometric model after another, measuring the error each time. Initially, he attempted to use a small oval-like path and even tried incorporating the old equant, a mathematical point that Copernicus had eliminated, to see if he could fit the data. But nothing gave a perfect match. Mars' observed positions differed by as much as 8 arcminutes, 8/60th of a degree, from the best circular or oval models Kepler could construct. Instead of dismissing this tiny discrepancy, Kepler famously said that the commander of 8 minutes, the error, will lead us to complete reform of astronomy. His contemporaries might have swept such a small error under the rug, but Kepler trusted the data. With Tycho's observations, this 8-minute discrepancy is a gift of God, he wrote, believing that such anomalies were clues to the true theory. After numerous failed attempts, Kepler made his greatest discovery. In late 1604, he had what one might call his second epiphany, the first being the Platonic solids model. Having tried over 40 different geometrical constructions to fit Mars's orbit, he finally considered that the path might be an ellipse rather than a circle or arbitrary oval. Ellipses were a simple conic section, a familiar shape, yet no astronomer before had dared suggest the planets literally travel on ellipses. Kepler had initially thought an ellipse was too simple. Surely, he imagined, the great minds of antiquity would have tried it if it worked. But when he plotted Mars's position as an elliptical path, with the sun at one focus of the ellipse, the data fit beautifully. The long-standing mystery of Mars's motion was solved. Mars, and by extension the other planets, move around the sun in ellipses rather than perfect circles. Kepler immediately generalized this insight into what we now call Kepler's first law. The orbits of the planets are ellipses with the sun at one focus. Furthermore, he had already deduced a rule for how a planet's speed varies along its orbit. By 1602, through laborious calculations, Kepler found that the line connecting a planet to the sun sweeps out equal areas in equal times, implying that a planet moves faster when nearer the sun and slower when farther. This became Kepler's second law of planetary motion, the area law. It was intimately linked to his assumption of a solar force. This area law mathematically represents a conserved motion consistent with a type influence, though he didn't formulate it in those terms. The area law mathematically represents a conserved motion consistent with a 1r2 type influence, though he didn't formulate it in those terms. By combining the area law with the elliptical shape, Kepler had constructed the first accurate physics-based model of planetary motion. While still engrossed in astronomy, Kepler turned his analytical genius to the science of light and vision. In 1604, he published Additions to Vitello, in which the optical part of astronomy is taught, often known more simply as Astronomiae Pars Optica. This tome was a truly groundbreaking work on optical science. Kepler built upon the medieval optics of Alhazen and Vitello, but he far surpassed his predecessors, earning the title of Father of Modern Optics. In Astronomiae Pars Optica, Kepler essentially founded the modern understanding of how we see and how light behaves. Light intensity, he formulated the inverse square law of light propagation, recognizing that the apparent brightness of a light source decreases with the square of the distance. This was a critical insight for astronomy, explaining, for example, the dwindling light of distant stars. Then we have reflection and pinhole images. Kepler systematically described the behavior of light upon reflection from flat and curved mirrors, laying groundwork for mirror optics. He also explained the principles of the pinhole camera, showing how a small aperture projects an inverted image, an analogy that would prove vital for understanding the eye's imaging. Then we have astronomical optics. Anticipating telescopic astronomy, Kepler treated the optical phenomena affecting astronomical observation. He analyzed how atmospheric refraction bends light, making, for instance, the sun appear distorted near the horizon, and investigated parallax and apparent sizes of celestial bodies. By doing so, he made it clear that astronomical sightings must account for optical efforts, hence the book's subtitle, The Optical Part of Astronomy. He touched on the vision in the eye. Most famously, Kepler solved the age-old riddle of how vision works. Rejecting ancient ideas that the eye emits visual rays, Kepler proved instead that an image of the world is formed inside the eye. He was the first to understand that the lens of the eye projects an inverted picture of the scene into the retina. I say there is vision, Kepler wrote, when a representation of the whole hemisphere of the world that is before the eye fixes itself on the concave surface of the retina. He likened the eye to a camera obscura, with the retinal image as its painting. Crucially, Kepler acknowledged that although the image is inverted, the mind interprets it correctly, effectively kicking off the study of physiological optics. Kepler's insights into vision were revolutionary. He explained the operation of corrective lenses for the first time as well, describing how concave lenses diverge light for the myopic and convex lenses converge light for the farsighted. This was not an invention of eyeglasses. They predated him by centuries, but it was the first scientific explanation of why lenses work to remedy vision. For all these contributions, Kepler's 1604 Optica is considered a major turning point in the development of the discipline of optics. A modern historian notes that the book contains the first statement that the image is created in the eye on the retina and not in the crystal lens. Kepler's contemporaries were astonished. His work on optics was truly ahead of its time, so much that Galileo, who built telescopes around the same years, largely ignored these new optical insights. Nonetheless, Kepler's blend of theory and practical explanation, he even delved into the theories of camera obscuras and the nature of lenses, justifies his reputation as the founder of modern optics. In Kepler's own delighted words, "Through understanding, light and vision, we're standing on the shoulders of giants, uncovering nature's secrets with newfound clarity." Kepler spent the next few years preparing a major treatise to announce these discoveries to the world. In 1605, he completed the manuscript, which by imperial privilege he titled Astronomia Nova, the New Astronomy. Due to delays, including legal disputes with Tycho's family over data ownership, the book was not published until 1609. When it finally appeared, it was nothing short of revolutionary. In it, Kepler narrates, in the first person, the long saga of his analysis of Mars, giving a candid account of false starts and failed hypotheses on the way to the truth. This was the first published account wherein a scientist documents how he has copied with a multitude of imperfect data to forge a theory of surpassing accuracy, as historian Owen Gingerich noted. In essence, Kepler was practicing a modern scientific method. He let observations guide theory, and he was willing to abandon beautiful ideas like nested polyhedra or combinations of circles when the data disproved them. He also firmly introduced physics into astronomy. In the very preface of Astronomia Nova, Kepler described his work as celestial physics, an excursion into Aristotle's metaphysics of motion applied to the heavens. He even likened the celestial machine not to a divine living being, but to a mechanical clock. My aim is to show that the celestial machine is to be likened not to a divine organism, but rather to a clockwork. In it, almost all the varied motions are carried out by means of a single, quite simple magnetic force. As in a clock, all motions derive from a simple weight, he wrote. This metaphor of the clockwork universe, driven by physical force, was a radical departure from the traditional view of heavenly spheres moved by guided intelligences or angels. Kepler had paved the way for understanding planetary motion as governed by natural law. While Mars and the Astronomia Nova occupied much of Kepler's time in Prague, other remarkable events and works also came during this period. In October 1604, a bright new star appeared in the constellation of Fucus, a supernova now known as Kepler's supernova. Initially skeptical of the rumors, Kepler observed it himself and began a meticulous study. This new star shone for over a year before fading, and it stirred fevered astrological speculation. It coincided with a great conjunction year, which some took as an omen. Kepler published a book in 1606 on the new star in Ophiuchus, analyzing the phenomenon. He demonstrated via the lack of measurable parallax that the star was far beyond the planets, in the realm of the fixed stars. This provided more evidence against the old Aristotelian doctrine of an unchanging celestial realm. The heavens could change, new stars could appear and then vanish. Kepler also cautiously addressed the astrological frenzy. While cataloging others' interpretations, he himself remained skeptical that the supernova heralded anything specific, beyond the general observation that nature occasionally produces rare events. Interestingly, Kepler appended to this book an essay on the Star of Bethlehem, prompted by a chronology study by Laurentius Susliga. Susliga argued that the calendar of Christ's birth was off by several years, placing the nativity around 4 or 5 BC. Kepler, connecting the dots, noted that a series of great conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn occurred around 7 BC. He speculated that the Star of Bethlehem might have been such a conjunction, possibly with a nova, analogous to the new star of 1604. This was an early example of Kepler's habit of blending scientific inquiry with religious and historical questions, an approach he expanded in other works on chronology. Kepler also made fundamental contributions to the field of optics during his Prague years. In 1609 to 1610, The invention of the telescope by Galileo and others opened a new frontier in astronomy. Galileo's startling telescope discoveries, mountains on the moon, moons around Jupiter, phases of Venus, and so on, were published in March 1610 in Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger. Galileo, facing skepticism, sought Kepler's endorsement. Kepler responded eagerly. In April 1610, he wrote an open letter of support, Conversation with Starry Messenger, in which he praised Galileo's findings and speculated on what they meant for cosmology. He enthusiastically confirmed that Galileo's reported phenomena were plausible and argued readers to trust the observations. Later that year, Kepler obtained a telescope himself, courtesy of Duke Ernst of Cologne, and trained it on Jupiter. By August 1610, he had independently observed Jupiter's 4 largest moons, and in 1611, he published Narrative about 4 satellites of Jupiter observed, further validating Galileo's discoveries. It was Kepler who first coined the term satellite for these secondary bodies, a term still used today. Kepler's support was immensely valuable to Galileo, who never publicly acknowledged Astronomia Nova, but certainly appreciated Kepler's championship of the Copernican cause. Armed with Brahe's unprecedentedly precise observation of the planets, especially Mars, Kepler spent the next decade in a tireless war with Mars, an intensive battle to reconcile theory with observation. The outcome was Astronomia Nova, New Astronomy. Kepler did not stop at observations. He turned his formidable analytical skills to the theory of telescopes. By late 1610, he had completed a manuscript on the optic of lenses and telescopic combinations. In 1611, he published this work as Dioptrus. In Dioptrus, Kepler explained how convex and concave lenses converge or diverge light, and he presented the design of a new improved telescope. The Keplerian telescope, also known as the astronomical telescope, it used 2 convex lenses, an objective and an eyepiece, resulting in a higher magnification and wider field of view than Galileo's original design, which used a concave eyepiece. The trade-off was that the Keplerian telescope produced an inverted image, but astronomers readily accepted that for the sake of the better performance. Essentially, all later refracting telescopes followed Kepler's design. Dioptrus also discussed the phenomenon of total internal reflection in the optics of the human eye, making it a foundational text in optical physics. By the end of his Prague period, Kepler had laid out groundwork not only in astronomy but in optics as well, showcasing his extraordinary broad scientific reach. Now a little bit more about this book. In 1610, Galileo's telescope had unveiled the moons of Jupiter and mountains on the moon. But how this new instrument worked was a mystery to most. Kepler, with his deep knowledge of optics, took up the challenge. In 1611, he published Dioptrus, the first theoretical treatise on the optics of telescopes. Dioptrus is a slim volume, but its impact was enormous. It laid the theoretical foundation for the modern telescope, introducing even the very term dioptrics, the study of refraction, that we still use today. Kepler's Dioptrus systematically explained how lenses bend and focus light to produce magnified images, something never before clarified. He began by giving the first correct explanation of the Dutch refracting telescope, the type invented in 1608 and used by Galileo. A convex objective lens gathers light from a distant object, and a concave eyepiece lens spreads it into an enlarged virtual image. More importantly, Kepler didn't stop there. He imagined new designs. In a stroke of genius, Dioptrus proposed a telescope with 2 convex lenses, a convex objective and a convex eyepiece. This configuration would produce an inverted image, but Kepler showed it would allow a much wider field of view and higher magnification than Galileo's design. This Keplerian telescope, also called the astronomical telescope, is a direct ancestor of the refracting telescopes used in observatories to this day. He even explored more complex arrangements, for instance, adding a 3rd convex lens to reinvert the image, creating an erecting telescope for terrestrial viewing, and a rudimentary version of a telephoto lens system for greater focus distance. All of this was purely theoretical. Kepler himself did not build these telescopes, but the designs he published were soon realized by others, validating his ideas. Within a few decades, the Keplerian telescope became the standard astronomical tool, once lens makers learned to mitigate the inverted image and lens imperfections. It is remarkable that Dioptrus also extended Kepler's investigations of vision. He revisited the problem of how lenses form images, reinforcing the explanation that real inverted images are formed, whether in a camera or inside the eye, a concept directly building on his 1604 optical work. In fact, Kepler included an appendix responding to Galileo's reports, the narrative on Galileo's sidereal messenger, in which he enthusiastically endorsed Galileo's discoveries and discussed how his own optical principles could explain the telescope's function. Thanks to Dioptrus, what had been a magical device was put on firm scientific footing. Kepler was the first to explain how lenses could be combined to magnify distant objects, a theory still relevant in today's optical sciences. For this, Kepler is often credited with inventing the improved refracting telescope, and indeed the design he outlined is known by his name. Historically, a Jesuit astronomer built the first working Keplerian telescope a few years later, corroborating Kepler's design. In sum, Dioptrus transformed the telescope from a curious gadget into a subject of science. It completed Kepler's trilogy of optical works, with the 1604 Optica and 1610 Optical Part of Astronomy Supplement, securing his legacy as a pioneer in both astronomy and optics. As a 2025 reissue of Dioptrus aptly noted, Kepler's work introduced the design of the Keplerian telescope and coined the term dioptrics, still in use today. The death of Emperor Rudolf II in 1612 and the succession of Matthias marked the end of Kepler's relatively secure tenure in Prague. Political and religious tensions, which had been brewing and would soon ignite the 30 Years' War in 1618, made Prague increasingly inhospitable for a Protestant scientist. Furthermore, Kepler had just undergone personal heartbreak. In 1611, an epidemic of Hungarian spotted fever struck Prague, and Kepler's wife Barbara fell gravely ill with seizures. Though she recovered initially, that autumn all three of their children caught smallpox. 6-year-old Frederick, Kepler's oldest son, died, and the other two, Susanna and Ludwig, were very sick. As if these blows were not enough, Kepler found himself entangled in a legal dispute over his late wife's modest estate. She had a small inheritance from her family. Worn out by these trials, Kepler sought to leave Prague. He attempted to return to Tübingen, but Lutheran authorities still there viewed him with suspicion for his theological nonconformity. They dubbed him too Calvinist-leaning, since Kepler advocated for intercommunion between Lutherans and Calvinists. Even the Duke of Württemberg turned him down on the advice of churchmen. Interestingly, the University of Padua in Italy, where Galileo had taught, reached out to Kepler in 1611. Galileo himself, departing Padua for Florence, had recommended Kepler as his successor. Kepler considered the prestigious Padua chair, but ultimately declined, preferring to keep his family in a German Protestant region and perhaps sensing that as a Protestant, he might not thrive under Venice's Catholic oversight. Instead, Kepler secured an appointment as a provincial mathematician, similar to his old role in Graz, in the upper Austrian city of Linz. Emperor Matthias permitted Kepler to leave Prague for Linz in 1612, while technically retaining his title and meager salary as an imperial mathematician, and would remain based there for the next 14 years. This period was marked by further personal turbulence, but also major scientific achievements. In Linz, Kepler's official tasks included teaching at the local gymnasium school and continuing to provide astrological and astronomical services such as calendars for the province. Compared to Prague, Linz offered more religious freedom at first. Matthias's regime was less actively repressive in Upper Austria, and Kepler initially enjoyed the ability to practice his Lutheran faith openly. However, Kepler's stubborn individualism in matters of doctrine soon caused friction with the Lutheran establishment. Because Kepler would not affirm the Orthodox Lutheran view of the Eucharist, he rejected the idea of Christ's physical ubiquity in the bread and wine, and he refused to sign the strict Formula of Concord. The Lutheran clergy excommunicated him, forbidding him from the Lord's Supper in 1613. In their eyes, Kepler was a heretic leaning toward Calvinism. Thus, ironically, this devout Christian found himself alienated by both Protestant and Catholic authorities. Christ the Lord neither is Lutheran, nor Calvinist, nor Papist, Kepler once remarked, urging more tolerance. His religious isolation in Linz was a heavy blow, but he bore it as the price of intellectual honesty. Some historians see the harsh treatment Kepler received from Lutheran pastors, his excommunication, and, a few years later, the targeting of his mother as a witch in the Lutheran town, as indicative of the counterattack he faced from his own camp for being so unorthodox. Despite these difficulties, Kepler found happiness again in his personal life. His first wife, Barbara, had died in Prague in 1611 during the tumultuous times, leaving Kepler a widower with 2 surviving young children. In Linz, Kepler decided to remarry. His approach to finding a second wife was characteristically analytical. He considered no fewer than 11 potential matches, evaluating their qualities and even making a ranked list, a process often cited as an early example of the optimal marriage problem in decision theory. His first several choices fell through. Some candidates rejected him, others were deemed unsuitable. But eventually Kepler returned to one of the earliest prospects, a 24-year-old named Susanna Rudinger. Susanna was not wealthy, but Kepler wrote that she won me over with love, humble loyalty, economy of household, diligence, and the love she gave the stepchildren. They married on October 30th, 1613. By all accounts, the second marriage was a much happier and more stable union than Kepler's first. Susanna and Johannes had 6 children together. Tragically, the first 3, Margareta Regina, Katharina, and Sebald, died in childhood, but the younger 3, Cordula, Fridmar, and Hildebert, survived to adulthood. Through these family ups and downs, Susanna provided a loving home life that sustained Kepler through his later travails. Kepler resumed his scientific work with the vigor in Linz. One of his early publications there was De Vero Anno, 1613, a treatise on pinpointing the year of Christ's birth. Using historical records and astronomy, the sighting of Herod's death, and the Star of Bethlehem calculations, Kepler concluded that Jesus was born in 4 BC, a result which is now standard in historical scholarship. He has also become involved in a project to persuade the Protestant German states to adopt the improved Gregorian calendar, which had been introduced by the Catholic Church in 1582. Many Protestant regions were hesitant to accept a papal reform. Kepler, pragmatic as ever, participated in deliberations in 1615 to 1616 to show that the Gregorian calendar was scientifically sound and not a tool of popery. Protestant states did eventually adopt it in Germany by 1700, thanks in part to such efforts. Even as Kepler published these works, a dark cloud was forming on his horizon: the witchcraft trial of his mother, Katharina. In 1615, back in Kepler's native Württemberg, an ugly series of accusations led to Katharina Kepler, then in her 70s, being charged with practicing witchcraft. The charges arose from local feuds. A woman had claimed Katharina bewitched her with a potion, but in the fevered atmosphere of the time, the threat was deadly serious. Dozens of alleged witches were being executed in the region. Kepler was horrified. In 1616, he traveled to Württemberg to intervene on his mother's behalf. For the next several years, amid his own work, he fought a legal battle to save her. The trial dragged on, with Katharina imprisoned in atrocious conditions from 1620 to 1621. Kepler prepared an exhaustive legal defense, drawing on his scientific mind to refute the ridiculous claims point by point. He even invoked his knowledge of astronomy to explain that a certain herb, wolfbane, she gathered was for legitimate medicinal use, not sorcery, and the reported apparitions could be explained naturally. His efforts succeeded. In late 1620, Katharina was acquitted and released, narrowly escaping a possible death sentence. Kepler's devotion during this crisis showed a very personal side of the scientist, a loving son who applied reason and eloquence to combat superstition. Some scholars have speculated that this episode also influenced Kepler's literary side. For years, since around 1609, Kepler had been tinkering with a manuscript called Somnium, the Dream, a fanciful story about a voyage to the moon, framed as a dream, narrated by a student of Tycho's. In the story, a witch and a demon help transport the protagonist to observe Earth from the lunar surface. The Somnium was partly an allegory defending Copernican astronomy by showing how the sky would look from another world, thus normalizing the idea the Earth is a planet. But it also contained autobiographical elements. The mother of the protagonist was a wise woman, clearly inspired by Katharina. A distorted version of Somnium's manuscript circulated during the trial, and some have argued it might have fueled the witchcraft accusations, as ignorant folk took Kepler's fictional demonology as evidence of his family dealings with the occult. After Katharina's ordeal, Kepler added extensive footnotes to the Somnium, 223 footnotes, much larger than the story itself, explaining the scientific content and clarifying the allegory. This work, often called the first piece of science fiction, was only published in 1634, but it stands today as a testament to Kepler's imaginative and humanistic side. Amid these personal battles, Kepler pushed toward the frontiers of astronomy. In 1617, he began publishing parts of a long-promised textbook, the Epitome of Copernican Astrology. The Epitome, published in 3 volumes between 1617 and 1621, was intended as a comprehensive guide to heliocentric astronomy for the uninitiated, modeled after Maslin's old geocentric textbook. However, as Kepler wrote it, it became much more than a beginner's guide. It was the summation of his own astronomical system, including all 3 of his planetary laws and his attempts to explain celestial motion by physical causes. The Epitome was written in question and answer dialogue form and was quite accessible by the standards of the day. It explicitly extended Kepler's first 2 laws, previously shown for Mars, to all the planets and even to the Moon and Jupiter's moons. It did not mathematically derive elliptical orbits from observations, something that was too complex for a handbook, but it taught readers how the planets move and encouraged them to accept the Copernican worldview free of Ptolemaic crutches. Initially, Volume 1, books through 1 and 3, was printed in 1617. Then Volume 2, Book 4, in 1620, and Volume 3, books 5 through 7, in 1621. This staggering publication was partly due to disruptions. In 1616, the Catholic Church placed all Copernican books on the Index of Prohibited Books, pending correction, making it dangerous to publish on heliocentrism under Catholic rule. Kepler was in Protestant territory, but he still took care. After 1618, as the 30 Years' War began, even Protestant publishers grew anxious. To avoid religious censure, Kepler pitched the later volumes of Epitome to more specialist readers. He made the arguments more rigorous and mathematical, and even left Copernican out of the titles of some parts so as not to draw overt attention. Nevertheless, the Epitome became the most widely used astronomy textbook in Europe and the decades after Kepler's death. Between 1630 and 1650, it effectively spread Kepler's ellipse-based astronomy to the next generation of astronomers. Many who were initially unconvinced by Kepler's 1609 new astronomy came to accept his models through the didactic Epitome. Thus, even if Kepler himself did not convert stalwarts like Galileo, his ideas steadily permeated the scientific community via this work. Kepler's other towering achievement in the Linz era was the completion of Tycho's legacy, the Rudolphine tables. These were new planetary tables and star catalog named after Emperor Rudolph II. Since 1601, Kepler had been obligated to produce them, but only in Linz did he have the peace to finish the laborious calculations. The project was huge. It required computing the positions of the planets over time using Kepler's laws and Tycho's data, now employing the latest aid, logarithms. John Napier had published The Invention of Logarithms in 1614, and Kepler soon grasped their value for reducing calculation drudgery. He even published a book of logarithm tables in 1624 and developed some of the underlying theory independently. By 1623, Kepler had finished the manuscript of the Rudolphine tables. However, the calamities of war delayed their printing. In 1625-26, a bitter peasant uprising and the invasion of imperial forces turned Upper Austria into a battleground. In 1626, rebels actually besieged Linz, and during the chaos, a fire broke out that burned down the printing house where Kepler's tables were in press, destroying a large portion of the work in progress. Kepler had to start over with a new publisher in the free city of Ulm. He left Linz in late 1626, as the war made it impossible to stay. Soldiers have even been quartered in his home. And by 1627, he succeeded in publishing the finished Rudolphine tables in Ulm. These tables were a triumph, far more accurate than any previous. They allowed astronomers and navigators to calculate planetary positions with unprecedented precision. To illustrate the power of his tables, Kepler used them to predict a transit of Mercury across the Sun on November 7th, 1631, and a transit of Venus in December of 1631, rare events. He sent out word to astronomers to watch. Indeed, the first prediction was vindicated when the French astronomer Pierre Gassendi observed Mercury's transit on the predicted date. Kepler's tables slightly missed Venus's transit. It happened but was not visible in most of Europe, which Gassendi didn't realize. The young English astronomer Jeremiah Horrocks corrected the parameters and successfully observed the transit of Venus in 1639, further confirming Kepler's system. The Rudolphine tables remained the principal reference for planetary motion for many decades until supplanted by Newtonian tables in the 18th century. The star catalog portion of the tables contained 1,005 stars, far more than any other previous catalog, each with updated coordinates. Tycho's original catalog had 777 stars. Kepler increased it by incorporating additional observations and even some of Ptolemy's and Johannes Bayer's entries for southern stars. It was the first pre-telescopic star catalog ever compiled. The positions were calibrated to Tycho's precise naked-eye measurements and refined by Kepler's calculations, achieving accuracies of 1 arcminute or better for many stars. Alongside the fixed stars, the Rudolphine tables provided planetary tables, essentially almanac data and formulas by which one could determine each planet's position on any date. These planetary tables were rooted in Kepler's model, heliocentric with elliptical orbits and area law motion. Because of this, they dramatically outperformed older tables based on circular or geocentric models. For example, the widely used Prutenic tables of the 1500s, based on Copernicus's circular orbits, could err by many degrees for Mars. Kepler's tables, using ellipses, hit much closer to the mark. As the University of Rostock History Summary notes, the Rudolphine tables were considerably more precise than earlier such tables and finally made heliocentric calculations practical and trusted. In a way, these tables were the proof of the pudding. If Copernicus and Kepler were right, the tables would predict celestial events correctly, and they did. Kepler, meticulous as ever, included in the tables all the tools an astronomer would need. He added corrections for atmospheric refraction, so that users could adjust a parent star and planet altitudes to true values. This was the first time refraction was accounted for in such tables. He also incorporated the new aid of logarithms, recently invented by John Napier, providing a table of logarithms and anti-logarithms to facilitate computations. This made the calculations far quicker and less error-prone, a very modern touch. The Rudolphine tables even came with a set of instructions and examples on how to use the data to determine things like planetary longitudes and latitudes. Kepler included a world map with this book, illustrating how one might find longitude by using lunar eclipses and the tabulated positions of the moon. The road to publishing the Rudolphine tables were long and fraught. Kepler inherited Tycho's observational data in 1601 when Tycho died, under the condition that he produced the tables and credit Tycho. He started the work in Prague, but soon came turmoil. Emperor Rudolf II, who had supported the project, was deposed by 1612. Kepler lost his position in Prague and had to move to Linz. The outbreak of the war and personal hardships, including the witch trial of his mother and the deaths of his children, delayed his progress. Moreover, Tycho Brahe's heirs hounded Kepler, attempting to claim Tycho's data and the profits of the tables. In letters, Kepler sometimes expressed weariness at the sheer drudgery of number crunching required. I beseech thee, my friends, do not sentence me entirely to the treadmill of mathematical computations, and leave me time for philosophical speculations which are my only delight. He pleaded to one impatient correspondent who pressed him for the tables. Indeed, calculating and checking hundreds of planetary positions by hand was a mammoth task, in an era before mechanical calculators, and Kepler was understandably reluctant. But his sense of duty and Tycho's dying wish compelled him to finish. By 1623, he had completed the manuscript. Securing funds to publish, however, was another challenge. Kepler literally chased down back pay and stipends across Central Europe to finance the printing. He finally gathered enough money for the paper and paid the printer largely out of his own pocket. Initially, he hoped to print in Linz, but the city became engulfed in the chaos of the 30 Years' War. So Kepler moved the operation to the free city of Ulm. There, after quarrels with the printer about accuracy, the first edition of 1,000 copies rolled off the press in September 1627, just in time for the autumn Frankfurt Book Fair. The Rudolphine tables were immediately recognized as a monumental achievement. Astronomers and navigators everywhere adopted them. For the first time, one could make reliable predictions of astronomical events. Within a decade, Johannes Schreck and others brought them to China, where in 1635, they helped Jesuit astronomer Adam Scholl van Bell reform the Chinese calendar. In essence, the Rudolphine tables did more to further the acceptance of a heliocentric model of the cosmos than any argument alone could. Their accuracy was convincing. They remained the premier reference until mid-century when newer data, and eventually Newtonian theory, produced better tables. Kepler dedicated the work to Rudolph's successor, Emperor Ferdinand II, since Rudolf II had died in 1612, but he kept Rudolph's name on the title in homage. The frontispiece of the published book is rich in symbolism. It depicts the great astronomers, Hipparchus, Ptolemy, Copernicus, and Tycho, gathered in a grand temple of Urania, muse of astronomy, with Kepler himself modestly represented among them. In the center, Copernicus and Tycho appear to debate, while nearby a depiction of Tycho's island observatory and Kepler's model of the solar system are shown. It's essentially a monument in print, celebrating the triumph of precise astronomy over the skies. And triumph it was. The Rudolphine tables encapsulated Kepler's legacy. They enshrined his 3 laws. All the calculations in the tables assumed elliptical orbits and area law timing, and they implicitly confirmed the harmonic law across the planets. They proved that the heliocentric cosmos was not only philosophically pleasing, but empirically superior. In a way, when Newton later said, "If I had seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." One of those giants was Kepler, and works like Rudolphine tables formed the very platform in which Newton stood. Kepler, through incredible perseverance, gave humanity a parting gift, the sky, mapped and tabulated, ready for future explorers to navigate both in reality and theory. By 1627, Kepler's scientific work was essentially completed, but his personal journey was entering a desperate phase. The 30 Years' War had engulfed Germany, and Kepler's patron, Emperor Ferdinand II, who had succeeded Matthias, who had little interest in supporting a Protestant mathematician. Kepler had also lost his position in Linz when he left. Now effectively unemployed with a family to support, Kepler wandered in search of a new patron. He found temporary refuge at the court of Albrecht von Wallenstein, the famous and infamous general of the imperial armies. Wallenstein was a cultured man with an interest in astrology. He believed importance and sought advice from astrologers. In 1628, Wallenstein invited Kepler to his estate in Sagan. Kepler spent some time as an advisor in Wallenstein's service, casting horoscopes and providing astronomical counsel. Yet this was not a long-term solution. In 1630, hearing that an imperial diet assembly would meet at Regensburg, Kepler decided to attend, hoping to petition for the payment of back salary still owed to him from his imperial post years before. It was a risky journey given the wartime conditions, but Kepler was determined. He had endured financial struggles for too long. He arrived at Regensburg in Bavaria in October 1630. There, exhausted from travel and the stresses of previous years, Kepler fell ill with a fever. Possibly a tropical fever or simply a feverish cold that turned deadly. On November 15, 1630, at the age of 58, Johannes Kepler died in Regensburg. "I used to measure the heavens. Now I measure the shadows of the earth. Although my mind was sky-bound, the shadow of my body lies here," reads the epitaph Kepler composed for himself. Because of ongoing conflict, Kepler's grave in Regensburg was neglected and within a few years was destroyed. The churchyard was ravaged during the war. Thus, no physical monument remained at his burial site. But Kepler's true monument was his scientific legacy, which soon spread across Europe and stands to this day. Kepler's contributions to knowledge were vast and varied. He is most celebrated for the 3 laws of planetary motion, which can be summarized as follows. 1. Planets move in ellipses with the sun at one focus. 2. A planet sweeps out equal areas in equal times, its speed varies such that it covers the same area segment of its orbit in a given time. And 3, the square of a planet's orbital period is proportional to the cube of its average distance from the Sun. These laws, empirically derived by Kepler from Tycho's data, were the first natural laws of astronomy, universal, precise, and expressed in mathematical form. Kepler published the first 2 laws in Astronomia Nova in 1609, and the third law a decade later in Harmonics Mundi in 1619. It is hard to overstate how revolutionary they were. They swept away the complicated epicycles of Ptolemaic astronomy and even the circular orbits of Copernicus, replacing them with a simple, elegant geometric description that actually matched the heavens. By introducing physical causality into celestial motions, Kepler also bridged the gap between astronomy and physics, which had been separate disciplines. This was considered impious or at least rash by some of his contemporaries. Kepler's own teacher, Maestlin, objected to the idea that the heavens were mechanical rather than ruled by divine spheres. But in hindsight, Kepler's approach was a critical step toward the modern scientific method. Later physicists like Newton would build directly on Kepler's laws. Famously, Newton proved in 1687 that if gravity pulls planets towards the Sun with an inverse square force, then Kepler's laws necessarily follow. Kepler's work thus provided one of the key foundations for the concept of universal gravitation. Beyond the planetary laws, Kepler achieved many firsts in science. In the field of optics, he was the first to explain how a telescope works and to design the improved Keplerian telescope with 2 convex lenses that became the standard for astronomical refractors. He was the first to correctly describe the formation of real, virtual, upright, and inverted images by lenses. He elucidated the role of the retina in vision, recognizing that the eye's lens projects an inverted image on it. He investigated pinhole cameras and mirror reflections, laying the groundwork for modern optics, so much that Astronomia Pars Optica had been called the foundation of modern optics. In mathematics, Kepler's 1615 book, New Stereometry of Wine Barrels, was a study in measuring the volume of barrels by thinking of them as stacks of cross-sectional disks, an approach that anticipated the development of integral calculus. Kepler's work on volume and the method of indivisibles would later inspire Cavalieri and indirectly Leibniz in the creation of calculus. Now a little bit more about this book of measuring wine barrels. Amid his astronomical endeavors, Kepler also produced a gem in mathematics, one born from a practical problem that literally rolled into his life. In 1613, while living in Linz, Kepler remarried. As the story goes, he purchased a large barrel of local wine for the wedding festivities, but the wine merchant's method of gauging the barrel's volume struck Kepler as crude and likely inaccurate. The merchant had simply inserted a rod through the hole and measured the fill height to set the price. An irked Kepler suspected the gauging stick method did not properly account for the barrel's shape. Could a short, squat barrel and a tall, skinny barrel of equal rod measurement really hold the same volume? Rather than shrug it off, the ever-curious mathematician saw a challenge. This wine barrel incident inspired Kepler to delve into the mathematics of volumes and led him to write this book. In doing so, Kepler made one of the earliest contributions to what would later be known as integral calculus. Despite its origin, this book is a serious work of mathematics. In it, Kepler develops a systematic method for calculating areas and volumes by an approach that foreshadows the use of infinitesimals. He essentially resurrects and extends the methods of Archimedes, imagining shapes to be divided into an infinite number of very thin cross-sections or indivisibles that can be summed to find volume. Kepler begins with simple cases, like the area of a circle, which he conceives as made of infinitely many triangular wedges, yielding the classic area formula, and then tackles more complex 3D solids. A large portion of the book is devoted to solids of revolution, shapes like barrels which can be generated by rotating a curve around an axis. Kepler computed or estimated the volumes of over 90 different such solids, ranging from cylinders and spheres to ellipsoids and toroids. In each case, he conceptually sliced the solid into infinitesimal disks or washers, summed their volumes, and arrived at results that are equivalent to what integral calculus would give, though he lacked our notion. For example, he found the volume of a sphere by summing the volumes of an infinite number of thin cones covering it, reaching the correct formula. Such reasoning was revolutionary for the time. Mathematicians would only much later formalize it. As historian C.H. Edwards noted, Kepler's approach in his stereometry was to dissect a given solid into an infinite number of infinitesimal pieces, convenient to the problem, then add them up. In other words, Kepler was doing calculus before calculus had been invented. Little wonder that this work is regarded as one of the most significant works in the prehistory of calculus, and Kepler is counted among the forerunners of Newton and Leibniz in this domain. This book did not stop at theory. Returning to the wine barrels, Kepler applied his methods to find out how to accurately measure their volume. He introduced the concept of a measuring rod calibrated not just by length, but by the barrel's geometry. He computed volumes for different barrel shapes and even posed an optimization problem. Given a certain amount of wood, a fixed barrel diagonal or circumference, what barrel shape, like the ratio of height to diameter, yields the maximum volume? This was essentially a problem of differential calculus, finding a maximum of a continuous function. Kepler approached it by intelligent trial. He determined that a barrel of a certain squat proportion held the most wine for its size. He discovered, in fact, that the merchant's preferred barrel design was nearly optimal, which, despite minor differences, vindicated the merchant's practice in a way, much to Kepler's amusement. Thus, Kepler's annoyance turned into insight. He showed the merchant's method was not wildly wrong, but he offered a far more rigorous way to get it right. In the process, he essentially formulated what later became known as Kepler's rule for volume, an early numerical integration scheme for solids of revolution. To share the practical benefits, Kepler even published a short German pamphlet in 1616 explaining the new measuring rules for artisans and wine cellars. In summary, this book stands out as a brilliant example of Kepler's versatility. Known primarily as an astronomer, here Kepler behaves as a true mathematician and even an innovator in engineering. He brings the abstract to the everyday, from calculating a circle's area to determine how much wine is in a barrel, all with unprecedented thoroughness. As one article puts it, Kepler's work is a systematic work on the calculation of areas and volumes by infinitesimal techniques. Today we use integral calculus to solve these kinds of problems. In bridging the gap between Archimedes and modern calculus, Kepler once again showed his conviction that nature, whether in the heavens or the Cooper's workshop, runs by knowable mathematical rules. And in doing so, he made even the measurement of wine an episode in the story of scientific progress. Kepler also independently devised a system of logarithms. After Napier's invention, Kepler published his own table of logarithms and contributed to their theoretical basis. In geometrical crystallography, Kepler wrote the first scientific essay on snowflakes, a New Year's gift of hexagonal snow in 1611. In this charming booklet, he asked why snowflakes always form six-cornered hexagonal symmetry. He mused that nature must arrange small spherical particles in the most efficient way, and conjectured that the densest way to pack equal spheres is in a pyramidal lattice, essentially stating the Kepler conjecture about sphere packing. This conjecture remained unproven until 1998, over 378 years later. In astronomy proper, Kepler made the first scientific attempt to measure the distance to the stars using parallax. He reasoned that if Earth's orbit produces no detectable parallax shift in stars' positions, the stars must be extremely far away. He correctly attributed the tides mainly to the moon's influence, a notion Galileo actually ridiculed at the time. And he was the first to realize that the sun itself rotates on an axis, noticing that sunspots, whose discovery by others in 1610 to 1611 he followed closely, must imply the sun spins. He even coined the word satellite. In the 1611 pamphlet, he introduced the term for Jupiter's moons, drawing on the idea of attendant followers of a planet. So many modern concepts and terminologies can be traced to Kepler's fertile mind. Back to Kepler. Little wonder that he is regarded as one of the founding figures of modern astronomy, physics, and science. Yet, Kepler was not a modern scientist in the narrow sense of excluding metaphysics or spirituality. He was a man of the late Renaissance, steeped in Neoplatonism, biblical theory, and even a dose of mysticism. Understanding Kepler's philosophy and mysticism is essential to understanding the man. He saw mathematics, particularly geometry, as holy. Geometry is one and eternal, a reflection of the mind of God. That share in it, accorded to humans, is one of the reasons that humanity is the image of God, Kepler wrote. This almost mystical reverence for geometry drove him to the Platonic solids model and later to the harmonies of the planetary motions. Kepler earnestly believed that the universe is built on harmonic principles, a cosmic music. In his magnum opus, Harmony of the World, in 1619, Kepler delved into his Pythagorean dream. He had spent years, since the Graz days, exploring how geometrical ratios, musical intervals, and the structure of nature might all be unified. And finally, in Book 5, he examines the harmony in planetary motions. There he articulates the third law in a musical context. The ratio of the square of planets' periods to the cubes of their distance is the same for all planets, a silent harmony. Kepler imagined that each planet, in its swift and slow motion, analogous to high and low notes, emits a tone. At different points in their orbits, planets sing different notes. For example, Earth, with its slightly varying speed, sings mi, fa, mi, and Kepler couldn't resist a wordplay. The Earth sings mi, fa, mi, so we can gather from this that misery and famine reign in our habitat. This dismal pun aside, Kepler truly thought the celestial motions found a grand formed a grand polyphony, the music of the spheres that philosophers had long hypothesized. He even identified specific musical intervals for planetary velocity ranges. For instance, Venus's speed range formed a nearly perfect fifth, Earth a minor third, and so on. He had some rivalry with the English Neoplatonist Robert Fludd on these matters. Fludd published his own harmonic theory around the same time, and Kepler sharply criticized Fludd for being speculative and numerological. But whereas Fludd's harmonies were tied to astrological mysticism, Kepler's were anchored in data. He quantified the angles and speeds. In the end, this book gave the world the third law, but it also stands as a testament to Kepler's metaphysical vision, a universe where mathematical beauty is not just aesthetic but real, where the celestial machine is not a kind of divine organism but a kind of clockwork created by God, and yet that clockwork produces a wondrous harmony perceptible to the intellect. Some say this book often reads like a hymn. Kepler's joy and reverence burst forth in the final pages as he addresses the divine. The heavenly bodies are nothing but a continuous song for several voices, perceived not by the ear but by the intellect, a music which sets landmarks in the immeasurable flow of time. It is no longer surprising that man, in imitation of his creator, has at last discovered the art of figured song. And even in more fervent prayer, he writes, "The wisdom of the Lord is infinite. Ye heavens, sing his praise. Sun, moon, and planets, glorify him in your ineffable language. Praise him, celestial harmonies, and all ye who can comprehend them." These poetic lines show Kepler saw his scientific work as profoundly spiritual. He felt he was thinking God's thoughts after him. With the third law, the Copernican cosmos had a new, harmonious order that only a divinely inspired geometrical mind could have arranged. Kepler's religious faith was absolutely central to his life, albeit an unorthodox one, and frequently spoke of God in his works. He saw a scientific vocation as a priesthood of sorts. "I am merely thinking God's thoughts after him," he is often quoted, a paraphrase of his own words. He believed God has designed the cosmos according to an intelligible plan accessible through reason, since humans are made of God's image with the capacity for understanding. This theological optimism fueled Kepler's dogged perseverance through years of calculation and frustration. He was convinced the underlying patterns would be simple and elegant because a perfect God would choose a perfect geometry. His faith also made him unafraid of upheaval. By placing the sun at the center and Earth among the planets, Kepler felt he was glorifying God's work rather than demoting Earth. In one of the beautiful passages at the end of Astronomia Nova, after working out Mars's orbit, Kepler offers a prayer of thanks. "I feel carried away and possessed by an unutterable rapture over the divine spectacle of heavenly harmony," he exults. He expresses gratitude that God permitted him to discover truths hidden for ages. Such spiritual language runs through many of Kepler's writings. At the same time, Kepler had an eerie humanist side to his religion. Living amidst the Catholic-Protestant conflict, he longed for reconciliation. As noted, Kepler was condemned by Lutheran authorities for being soft on Calvinists. He openly argued for toleration among Christian sects. Christ the Lord was neither Lutheran nor Calvinist nor Papist, he wrote, challenging partisans on all sides. This spirit won him no friends in orthodoxy, but it speaks to Kepler's independent mind and moral courage. He managed remarkably to maintain patronage under Catholic emperors and friendships with Jesuit scientists, like those who vetted his mother's trial, even as he personally remained Protestant. His ultimate loyalty was to truth as he saw it, whether in science or faith. Kepler's blend of occult and rational thinking is best illustrated by his stance on astrology and witches. As we described, Kepler practiced astrology but sought to reform it by stripping out superstition and basing it on empirical correlations. For example, he believed the weather might be influenced by planetary aspects, and he thought the human soul could resonate with cosmic harmonies, but he mocked the simplistic horoscope predictions of quacks. In his Tertius Interveniens, he calls out both the thick-headed band of fat-bellied astrologers and those who dismiss astrology entirely, urging a middle way. To him, astrology was a vestige of an older mode of thought that could be modernized or at least used carefully. Regarding the occult, Kepler showed deep personal bravery in saving his mother from a witch trial, effectively pitting scientific reasoning against fear and ignorance. After that, in the Somnium's extensive footnotes, he explained at length that what appeared as demons and spirits in his story were actually astronomical allegories or natural phenomena. For instance, he detailed the physical conditions of the moon and described how one might experience weightlessness there, all couched in a fantastical narrative as a clever literary device. It is a little wonder that Somnium earned Kepler recognition as a progenitor of science fiction. The novel's strange mixture of witchcraft and space travel mirrors Kepler's own life, straddling a superstitious past and a scientific future. Some astronomers accepted elliptical orbits but not the area law. For example, Others, like Seth Ward, tweaked Kepler's model to fit their comfort. Giants of science such as Galileo and René Descartes paid surprisingly little public attention to Kepler's Astronomia Nova. Galileo, though a friend and ally of Kepler in the Copernican cause, never explicitly endorsed the elliptical orbits. He stuck to circular orbits in his writings, possibly because he lacked the physics to justify ellipses. Descartes, too, formulated a cosmology of vortices that ignored Kepler's laws. It would take time, and new observational proofs, like the transit of Mercury in 1631, observed right on schedule by Gassendi using Kepler's prediction, to convince the broader scientific community that Kepler's system was truly superior. The turning point arguably came with Isaac Newton. By the late 17th century, thinkers like Robert Hooke and Giovanni Borelli were incorporating Kepler's idea of attractive forces into their theories. Newton's Principia Mathematica in 1687 then provided the master synthesis. It derived Kepler's three laws from a single universal law of gravitation. This not only validated Kepler's laws beyond doubt, but elevated them to the status of necessary consequences of physical principles. The problem of why planets move as they do, which Kepler could only answer with a vague motive soul or magnetic force from the sun, was finally answered by Newton with gravity and mechanics. Newton famously acknowledged his debt to Kepler's work, saying that by standing on the shoulders of giants like Kepler and Galileo, he could see further. In solving the Kepler problem, as it came to be known, finding the force law that gives rise to Kepler's orbits, Newton cemented Kepler's place as a central figure in the scientific revolution. In the history and philosophy of science, Kepler's legacy has also been richly examined. Enlightenment-era historians sometimes downplayed Kepler's mystical side. By contrast, 19th century Romantic scholars like E.F. Occult, who studied Kepler's unpublished manuscripts in detail, celebrated the unity of Kepler's scientific and spiritual vision. Occult, in 1849, wrote the first full biography of Kepler, portraying him as a hero of the revolution of the sciences, who fused mathematical rigor with aesthetic and religious insight. In the 20th century, Alexandre Core's influential studies of Kepler in the 1930s further highlighted Kepler's role in transforming our worldview from an ancient closed cosmos to a modern infinite universe. Core emphasized Kepler's Platonic and mystical motivations as positive driving forces in his scientific breakthroughs. Philosophers of science have repeatedly used Kepler as a case study. For instance, Karl Popper pointed to Kepler's bold conjectures and attempts at falsification Kepler tested dozens of hypotheses against data, discarding those that didn't work, as exemplary of the scientific method. Kepler's confrontation with the competing worldview of flood even got the attention of psychologist Wolfgang Pauli, who wrote about it in the context of conflict between rational analysis and archetypal symbolism. In short, Kepler's work has been a treasure trove for scholars examining how science evolves and how human creativity bridges the gap between mysticism and empiricism. Culturally, Kepler's influence has extended into literature, music, and the arts. His life and ideas have inspired novels, operas, and artworks. For example, the Irish novelist John Bainville wrote Kepler in 1981, a lyrical, fictionalized biography that won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. Bainville's novel explores Kepler's inner world, his dreams, his anxieties, his spiritual musings against the backdrop of the chaotic 17th century, bridging the distant figure to life for modern readers. In music, the American composer Philip Glass premiered an opera titled Kepler in 2009. This opera portrays episodes of Kepler's life in a series of theatrical scenes set to Glass's signature minimalistic but emotionally charged score. Glass was fascinated by Kepler's quest for order and juxtaposition of scientific and mystical themes. The city of Linz, where Kepler lived, commissioned the opera as part of a celebration of science and art. Even in film, Kepler's cosmological ideas have made appearances. The 2012 science fiction film Mars et Avril opens with imagery based on Kepler's model for Harmonious Mundi, illustrating a universe whose harmony is determined by celestial motion. The film's music score, composed by Benoit Carist, was even crafted according to Kepler's harmonic theory, translating the planet's orbital ratios into musical cues. In the visual arts, Kepler's own drawings, such as his diagram of the nested Platonic solids, often reproduced as a striking image of a sphere within a cube within a sphere, and so on, or his sketches of Mars' orbit are frequently celebrated for their aesthetic beauty. Modern artists and poets see in Kepler a figure of the contemplative scientist, someone whose sense of wonder and poetic description of nature, his writings are full of metaphors and sometimes lapses into poetic language, bridges the two cultures of science and art. The most famous poem historically associated with Kepler is actually one he didn't write but inspired. The Latin verses on the front piece of the Rudolphine Tables, written by an unknown poet, praise the unity of God's creation and the astronomer's task in measuring the stars. Those verses call on astronomers to serve eternity by joining the divine order of the heavens with human inquiry, an apt summation of Kepler's ethos. Kepler's name today adorns many honors in science. The Kepler Space Telescope, launched by NASA in 2009, has discovered thousands of exoplanets, truly continuing Kepler's legacy of planetary discovery. The mission was named in tribute to him. Appropriately, one of its great successes is finding planetary systems that confirm that Kepler's laws are universal. Even solar systems around other stars follow the same rules. The lunar crater Kepler and the asteroid 1134 Kepler also bear his name, ensuing he is literally inscribed among the heavens he studied. In Kepler's hometown, Wiel-der-Stadt, and other cities he lived in, Linz, Prague, Graz, there are museums and monuments honoring him. A statue in Linz depicts him thoughtfully holding a model of orbits, and in Prague, a joint monument to Kepler and Tycho Brahe stands as a symbol of their cooperation. Kepler's life has also served as an inspiration and reflections on the relationship between science and religion. The MIT Independent Activities Period once ran a series on Faith of Scientists, featuring Kepler, noting how his belief in cosmic order powered his science. In the realm of occult and esoteric, Kepler's influence is more indirect but still notable. While Kepler helped discredit traditional astrology among scientists after his time, the two fields decisively split. By the 18th century, no serious astronomer practiced astrology. There remains an astrological Kepler in the sense that some astrologers today view him as a reformer of their art. Kepler College in Seattle, an astrology school, is named after him, somewhat paradoxically, given Kepler's own mixed feelings about astrology. Additionally, Kepler's emphasis on geometric harmony influenced later mystics and New Age thinkers who romanticized sacred geometry. The image of the 5 Platonic solids governing the cosmos, for example, resurfaces in esoteric literature as a symbol of hidden order. Kepler's successful blending of mystical intuition and empirical rigor stands as a challenge and model to anyone, even today, who seeks to reconcile holistic or spiritual perspectives with scientific method. Johannes Kepler's life was a tapestry woven with threads of genius, faith, hardship, and perseverance. He was born into a world defined by rigid spheres and divine immutability, yet he imagined a new world and lived to see it start to take hold, a world where planets soar along ellipses in an infinite universe governed by mathematical law. It is hard to picture the courage it took for Kepler to pursue his vision. He labored for years virtually alone, calculating by hand, often under financial duress and personal anguish, guided only by a fierce conviction that the cosmos had a rational order he could discern. Truth is the daughter of time, and I feel no shame in being her midwife, Kepler wrote, expressing his willingness to endure doubt and ridicule in order to eventually birth the truth. Indeed, time has vindicated him. The treasures hidden in the heavens proved richer than anyone knew, and Kepler opened those treasure troves with keys of geometry and physics. Through his laws, we launched satellites to Mars and predict eclipses. Through his optics, we peered to the edge of the universe with giant telescopes. Every time a spacecraft uses an orbital transfer or a transit method and finds a new exoplanet, Kepler's legacy is alive. And yet, beyond the technical triumphs, there is something profoundly human and heartfelt in Kepler's story. He was, as he said, moved by the geometry of the universe, by the shapes of the stars and the planets, and by the perfection of the forms in nature. In an era of war and witch hunts, Kepler held fast to the belief that the world is intelligible and beautiful. He never lost his sense of wonder. At the end of the harmony of the world, upon discovering the third law, Kepler broke into a prayer of gratitude and awe. I feel carried away and possessed by an unutterable rapture over the divine spectacle of the heavenly harmony, he gushed. Lord, I thank you that you have allowed me to see the beauty in your work. Such words remind us that science for Kepler was not merely about cold numbers, but a passionate quest to touch the mind of God. After a lifetime of struggle, Kepler died far from home, without wealth or high rank, but he left us the very equations that describe the dance of the planets. On his humble grave, before it vanished, a friend recorded Kepler's own self-composed epitaph. I used to measure the heavens. Now I measure the shadows of earth. Although my mind was skybound, the shadow of my body lies here. In those lines speaks a man who knew his place in the grand scheme, a child of earth who reached for the stars. Johannes Kepler's legacy lives on in every orbit calculated, every harmony found in nature, and every soul who looks up at the night sky and even for a moment feels carried away by the unutterable rapture of its beauty. His life show, the show of a fearless intellect lighting a candle in the dark cosmos, who continues to inspire and resonate, a rich and heartfelt testament to the unity of science and wonder.